to ring.
We got to get those
Or
down, though.
somebody with a New York whistle.
It is.
I never could do that whistle. You know,
Put your fingers in the mouth like
yeah,
this.
yeah, and no.
I wish I could do that. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, and welcome to the Babcock Smith House. I said to Hugh, I never knew that this many people were interested in red and pink granite, so this is really, really nice. Before we begin, I would like to just announce that Maureen Bjorklund will be presenting our next program on February 18th. It's a program on Wallace nutting. And the story behind it, I'm going to not give, oh, you don't want me to give anything? Okay, there's a connection. There's a connection to the Babcock Smith House. Let us put it that way, which is what started Maureen volunteering to do the research and figure out what was going on and give us a program about Wallace nutting. If you don't know who he was the one who did the photographs and then had his crew hand tint them and did a lot with furniture, and that's enough because we're on Granite today. Hugh is our newest trustee, but that, yes. But that doesn't mean that he hasn't had a long and faithful record of volunteering here. He is a researcher par excellence, and he's fastidious about details. And of course, many of you know that he's given us at least one program every year since he started, so we're very appreciative of that. So today, we're going to be talking about Westerly red and pink granite, which is why you're all here. So take it away.
Great, thank you. So I've never done this before. I wrote out my whole talk because it was running way too long, and so to hopefully keep it down to a reasonable time, so hopefully this will work well. So thank you for being here. I'm thrilled that there are so many people here, and I hope you enjoy this look back at some of the history of red and pink granite and Westerly. I, for one, particularly like the red and pink stone, you know, here shown on the church downtown. It really is quite beautiful. And of course, the Westerly Town Hall is a wonderful example of red granite using the two different finishes to create the contrasting colors, the lighter for the smooth finish on the columns and trim, and the darker for the rough cut stones. Though when I was down a few weeks ago and it was raining, and I was going to the town hall, to the property records, I noticed that the colors were more similar when they're wet. It takes the being dry to show the difference. This stone came from the New England Granite Quarry off Old Hopkinton Road called the Redstone Quarry, shown here in the drawing published in 1906 in the Westerly Sun for a story about cutting red granite for the Travelers Insurance Building in Hartford. In August 1897, the Westerly Sun's Granite Chips column describes a monument for the Robinsons. And I show you here a picture from the Find a Grave website with its really striking dark red and amazingly modern but beautiful, simple geometric design. I really think this is, you know, extraordinary. It's described as an 8-ton monolith designed by James Barrison Jr. of the New England Granite Works. Now, New England Granite was a major source of redstone, but today I'm really focusing on other operations. The Titanic Memorial in Washington, D.C. is one of the few statues carved in red granite. Generally, gray or pink granite have finer grain that was preferred for carving. Henry Smalley provided the stone from Westerly, and we'll talk more about that later. When I was first curious about red and pink granite, I noticed that Smalley's company was called Smalley Pink and Red Westerly Company. So I figured I'd research it and see what I could learn about red and pink granite. And I'll only touch on Smalley today because I've again focused on earlier history, but I could give you a whole talk on Smalley if you want. I want to start the history with this publication, which I mentioned in my last talk, by the Reverend Dennison in the Providence Journal, published in 1867, just 20 years after Orlando Smith purchased the Babcock farm. So there's already published a history of granite just 20 years later. He notes that there are 7 quarries producing stone of several colors, including white, blue, and red. There are paragraphs on each of the 7 quarries, as well as one noting that the American Indians had obtained steatite soapstone in the Westerly area. Talking about Fraser's land, he says there is, quote, a rich and extensive vein of red granite, end quote. In the paragraph on Macomber, he says the granite is white and blue with, quote, occasional veins of red, end quote. Later, he writes, we have alluded to Westerly's substantial mines of wealth in her hills of white and red granite. So clearly the varied colors of granite are one that of its attributes that people were very attracted to from early on. 3 years later, in 1870, Beers and Company published an atlas of maps of Rhode Island with a map of the whole Westerly area and one of downtown Westerly and Pawcatuck. Blowing up the Westerly map, we can find 6 of the 7 names of quarries that Reverend Dennison mentioned. Smith, Ledward, Fraser, north of the railroad, Macomber, Clark, and Chapman. Now, some are clearly indicated as quarries and some aren't. Missing are Jonathan and Ephraim Lamphere, while George W. Cottrell's quarry is shown perhaps because he was a subscriber to the map. One of the challenges of historical research is that sources may have incomplete or apparently different information. For example, Chapman's quarry is shown here north of Chapman Pond, and we'll talk about that again later. Returning to the 1867 Dennison article, his paragraph on Fraser goes on to say, quote, the high bluff and ridge were leased to Mr. Orlando Smith, and the quarry is now worked in the name of the Smith estate by Mr. W.A. Burdick. The granite here obtained is greatly prized for building purposes, end quote. I searched the Westerly property records for William Fraser and Orlando Smith and found several transactions in 1850 and 1851. There are a couple of years after Smith bought these are a couple of years after Smith bought the Babcock farm. Much of Fraser's land was obtained before 1850, but these records are not available online. And the original indexes, which I've looked at, are often very difficult to read. From 1850 on, the indexes are available online. And so there were 2 sales to Orlando Smith in 1850 and 2 in 1851. I'm showing you here the red cover of the Land Evidence Book 19, with the shelves behind where books are stored horizontally in the town clerk's office, mostly downstairs in the basement. I'm also showing page 57, the first sale between Fraser and Smith, entirely handwritten. From 1850 to about 1909, the documents are copied by hand into these books, so only the index of transactions is available online. Around 1909, the typewriter came into use, so full documents are available online from then to the present day. Often deeds are really pretty boring. Just saying that a lot of land is sold by one person to another and describing the parcel and noting the owners of the lands bordering on it, which actually turns out to be very valuable information. But to my surprise, the deeds between Fraser and Smith describe a somewhat complicated business relationship, not just land sales. The first deed indicates that for $500 paid by Smith, Fraser sells him the stone on 20 acres. Smith has rights to access the land with teams of draft animals to carry the stone and to, quote, build as many sheds and blacksmith shops, end quote, as needed for the quarrying of the stone. But it also says that Smith, quote, shall not disturb the wood on the said premises any more than is absolutely necessary, said Fraser to have the privilege of pasturing said premises and taking wood therefore at all times, end quote. Fraser is maintaining the rights to farm since much of the land will not actively be used for quarrying. 10 days later, Smith buys an adjacent 1 acre where he can build a barn, but once again, it's a more complicated business relationship rather than a simple land sale. Smith agrees to build a fence. Fences were important markers separating properties in deeds, though they may have also been useful to keep people and animals separate. When Smith builds the barn, Fraser has the right to the manure. Presumably. Finally, Fraser gets the feed grown on the acre. Smith is building a granite quarry business, but Fraser keeps rights useful to farming, which is his occupation listed in the census records. The next year, there are 2 transactions. Again, in the first sale, there's a requirement for building a fence, and this is the one I think that actually says how high it has to be, 4 feet or 4.5 or something. The second sale has 2 lots. One is described as providing an access highway as well as land for the barn, though Smith gets the manure this time. Quote, the second lot is to be used by said Smith for the purposes of depositing waste stone and chips and for working stone, end quote. So these deeds really provide a picture of the activities going on, not just the land being sold. In 1908, 60 years later than the deeds we were just talking about, the U.S. Geologic Survey issued a bulletin authored by T. Nelson Dale that describes the quarries of Westerly. Dale describes a Fraser quarry for gray stone of good size, 250 by 200 feet and 50 feet deep, that is not operating. He also describes Smith North Quarry as producing red and pink Westerly granite, having started before 1892. Dale has a map showing quarry locations, and if I blow up north of the railroad, you see numbers 5 through 10 between Old Hopkinton Road on the right and High Street on the left. Hopkinton there. 5 is Redstone Quarry from New England Granite. 6 is Smith North Quarry. 7 is Calder and Kearney, which we'll talk about. 8 is Dixon Quarry, also then bought by Sweeney. 9 is Fraser Quarry, in between Redstone and the Smith North. 10 is Chapman Quarry. Notice that Chapman Quarry, number 10, is not north of Chapman Pond on this map, and Dixon Quarry, number 8, is not adjacent to Smith North Quarry, number 6. We'll come back to all of this at the end. I really enjoy doing this historical research because it's kind of like puzzle solving, you know, tracing history backwards and forwards. So as I mentioned, I started looking into Smalley, Pink, and Red Westerly Company because of its name. Turns out the Westerly property records in 1920 report that the name change occurred in 1913. 11 years later, in 1931, Smalley sells all his local properties to Westerly Pink Quarries, a company formed by the Smith family. But we're not going to talk about any of this later history. I'm going to focus on the earlier story. The corporate name change came about because he bought not just the quarry, but also the business and goodwill that went with it of the Calder and Kearney Westerly Granite Company was formed in 1906 to buy the land and quarry business that Calder and Kearney purchased in 1891. 15 years earlier, when they bought the 80-acre homestead of Jonathan Lamphere, whose name wasn't even on the map in 1870. Oddly, 2 years earlier in 1889, the New England Business Directory lists Calder and Kearney and Westerly under quarries. So I was wondering what was up with that. Jonathan Lamphere died in 1885. Yes, 1885. But the only property sale that year is a 1.5 acre woodlot. Dale says that the Calder and Kearney quarry hole started in 1882, which would be when Lamphere owned the land. And of course, that's 25 years after the Reverend Dennison reports that the Lampheres were quarrying on Cormorant Hill. Is anybody familiar with Cormorant Hill as a name? No. So how does this all fit together? I'll start with the Lampheres and move forward, and I'll tell you it as best as I've pieced it together, not that we understand everything. So, in the 1850 census, they report the household of Maxim Lamphere immediately after the household of William Fraser, who had been talking about, you know, selling the stone to Orlando Smith. So they were next door neighbors at some distance. Notice the spelling with an M, but it's clear from the listed names that this is the Lampheres, and the spelling with the N is used on their headstones and other documents, so that's how I've spelled it. So one of the challenges all the time in historical research is to figure out when two spellings are variant spellings on somebody's name and when it's actually two different people. Maxon is 80 years old and a prosperous farmer with $1,000 of real estate, living with his wife Susanna, 76, their son Jonathan, a farmer aged 41, their daughter Bathsheba, 38, and Ephraim, 35, who's listed as a stonecutter. 4 other children, they had 4 other children, but they live elsewhere. In the 1860 census, Maxon and Susanna have died, and Ephraim is now reported to be a farmhand, although he's only aged 5 years from the previous census. You can't believe everything you read. Jonathan is a 50-year-old farmer and is joined by his wife Lydia, 38. Neither the Fraser household nor Bathsheba Lamphere are listed. They appear to have been missed, although in 1857, 3 years before this census, Bathsheba married William Fraser. She was his second wife. They didn't have children. He had children by his first wife. I'll mention again that in 1867, Reverend Dennison reports the Lampheres are quarrying on Cormorant Hill and notes it is fine quality but in thin strata, so it's mainly used for paving stones, stone posts, and the like. In the 1870 census, Jonathan is a prosperous farmer with his wife Lydia and their daughter Elma. The Fraser household is listed as William, Bathsheba, and Ephraim, age 55, who should have been listed as Ephraim Lanphier, but isn't. For a long time, I thought Ephraim wasn't listed in the census at all, even though a year later, in 1871, Westerly property records report that he leases 3/4 of an acre for quarrying to the Hughes brothers from Stonington. Michael Hughes is recorded as signing with an X, indicating he doesn't read or write. So it seems likely that they were the ones who were actually going to carry out the quarrying work. This further supports Reverend Dennison's reports of the Lampheres quarrying on Cormorant Hill. Finally, in 1872, the Providence Journal published a paragraph from the Westerly Weekly, quote, "The body of Ephraim Lamphere, who has been missing some 4 weeks, was discovered on Monday in the cove of the Pawcatuck River near the residence of Gordon Hiscock. It was buried the same day, there being no question that he came to his death by drowning," end quote. His headstone in the First Hopkinton Cemetery gives its dates as 1814 to 1872. Jonathan Lamphere lived until 1885. His will left his wife Lydia $1,800. That year, the Westerly tax book indicates that the heirs of Jonathan Lamphere were taxed on $1,800 real estate and $600 personal property. A sale is recorded on November 10th, 1885, of a 1.5 acre woodlot by the estate executor for only $12. But it was a sale at public auction, and the town clerk pasted the ad from the Narragansett Weekly into the book, and it turned out to be enormously informative. For the sale was a farm and quarries. The farm of about 80 acres, described as well wooded with a good supply of water, a dwelling house and other buildings in good condition. And quote, "The property includes valuable stone quarries," end quote, now being worked under leases terminated October 1st, 1885, end quote. So that's a day after the auction, which was September 30th, but the sale of the 1.5 acres wasn't recorded until a couple of weeks later. I don't know why only the 1.5 acre woodlot sold, but it was a key to learning that there were actually quarries, not just the farm, on the 80 acre Jonathan Lamphere homestead that Robert Calder and Henry Kearney purchased 6 years after the public auction for $1,800 in 1891. Note that the amount is the same that Jonathan Lamphere left his wife Lydia, so it seems likely to me that one goal was to get that much for the sale. Since the Lamphere quarries were leased at the time of the auction, and Calder and Kearney are listed in the New England Business Directory as having a quarry in 1889, 2 years before they actually bought the land, I would speculate that they may have been leasing the quarry and perhaps needed time to accumulate funds to buy it. Starting the next year, they advertise and are listed in the Westerly directories. Although this page that I'm showing you is from 1894, but the ad in 1892 is identical. Their ad notes gray or red granite in rough stock or dressed and says, quote, "Quarries Rear Smith North Quarry," which indicates to me that Smith's North Quarry was a well-established landmark, probably having been there since Fraser in the 1850 transactions with Orlando Smith. Arthur Murray and Company are advertising fine red granite, a specialty, although their west side quarry location is really Pawcatuck. Ewan and Company offer blue, pink, white, or red granite. In 1895, 4 years after Calder and Kearney purchased the quarry, Everts and Richards issue a map of Westerly. And this is my favorite map because it shows my great-grandfather's company, quarry, Lazary and Barton, off Pound Road. The map shows the Smith North Quarry, Dixon Granite Works, and further north, Nathan Dixon Granite Company, the Westerly Granite Company, New England Granite Company off Old Hopkinton Road with a railroad spur, and Chapman Granite Company. And that really is where Chapman Granite was. It's not north of Chapman Pond, although who knows whether there was another quarry earlier. Now, Calder and Kearney aren't even listed on this map, but we know they're active because in September of 1895, the Westerly Sun ran a front page story about the first Labor Day parade and lists the parade order of businesses with floats and groups of granite workers. The article text reports that Calder and Kearney had 6 men busy on their float. So they were busy even though they weren't on the map.
Maybe they didn't pay to be on the map.
Maybe. We can learn some about Calder and Kearney Quarry from newspapers, trade publications, business directories, and other sources. In 1895, the misordered and misspelled Kearney and Calder were one of the companies settling a pavers strike. This misspelling of Kearney occurs not frequently, but it occurs other places. 2 years later, the Westerly Sun reports, quote, J.T. Kenyon delivered a new gondola this morning to Calder and Kearney quarrymen. This is a stone wagon made specially for their business and weighing 4,600 pounds. There are only 1 or 2 like it in town, end quote. In 1900, they placed a help wanted ad for a, quote, teamster to live at the quarry and take care of the oxen. 2 hammers were stolen from the blacksmith shop in 1902. And in 1903, they were among the companies that received orders from the city of Providence to provide tens of thousands of paving blocks. The trade magazine Monumental News in 1904 says Messrs. Calder and Kearney are getting out some fine pink stock. They have made some large shipments to Philadelphia recently. Now, Calder and Kearney Granite Works was a quarry and didn't cut or carve monuments, so perhaps it's not surprising that for a couple of years they had a business relationship with a monument dealer in Quincy, Massachusetts, Malnati, who advertised that he was, quote, the sole agent for the celebrated Calder and Kearney Pink Westerly Granite. This 1899 letter to Orlando Smith Jr. in the museum's collection also shows Malnati's description as the sole agent for the celebrated Calder and Kearney Pink Granite. But in 1899, Malnati purchased a quarry in East Lyme, Connecticut, and starts selling his own golden pink granite, though advertisements continued in the Reporter until 1900. I've gotten ahead of myself. Oh, jeez, I'm going the wrong way. Let's go back, sorry. Okay. So we know a little bit about employment at Calder and Kearney because the Rhode Island factory inspection reports begin to report the number of workers in 1905. Before that, they only reported on working women and children who were largely absent from the granite industry, so they weren't reporting on granite companies. Calder and Kearney were sold to Smalley in 1906, but employment is between 10 and 13 men from 1905 to 1911. Employment numbers are more variable from 1918 to 1930 for Smalley, but Smalley purchases 2 other quarries during this time as well. I haven't found much of any documentation about who the workers per Calder and Kearney were, except that in the 1895 Westerly Sun story, that it not only says that 6 men were kept busy on the float, but it gives their names. Frank Calhoun, W.E. Thompson, Henry Thompson, Michael Sullivan, Joseph Telford, and Joseph Taylor, and presumably they all worked for Calder and Kearney. The museum archive has some records from the Quarry Workers International Union, the Paving Cutters Union, and the Granite Cutters Union. But while they list names of workers, they don't list the companies that those workers worked for. So these are the only 6 men that I've identified as working for the Calder and Kearney Quarry. So who were Henry Kearney and Robert Calder? We can learn about them and their families from records including the Westerly town directories, U.S. and Rhode Island censuses, and the Westerly Sun, which was founded in 1893. There is too much to describe in detail, but not surprisingly, family and business are interconnected, and so I'll summarize. Both men were born in Scotland, Henry Kearney about 4 years before Robert Calder. Kearney came to the U.S. earlier in 1868, and once in Westerly, Pawcatuck, married Euphemia Jeffrey. They had 2 daughters, Elizabeth, also called Bessie, and Edith, in 1873 and 75. Robert Calder came to the U.S. in 1874 with his younger brother, John. They also settled in Westerly. Town directories show Robert boarding with John, his younger brother. John and Emma Jeffrey, Euphemia's sister, have 2 children, Isabel and John, in 1880 and 1883. But in 1885 Rhode Island census, the Kearney family and their niece and nephew, the 2 Calder children, John Calder's children, are reported as a household of 6. Emma Calder died in 1885, and John Calder died the next year. Robert Calder never married and helps to raise his niece and nephew, and they live as an extended Calder and Kearney family here initially at 17 Dixon Street. Calder and Kearney then bought the quarry in 1891. In 1894, Thomas Calder, another brother, joined them at 17 Dixon Street from Scotland. A few years after buying the quarry, they moved to 138 High Street, just north of the bridge over the railroad tracks. That house is still there. The Westerly Sun in 1897 reports the horse got spooked by a train and crashed the glass-topped laundry wagon that was pulling, quote, in front of the house occupied by Mr. Henry Kearney. Later that year, one of the local columns reports that, quote, the Mrs. Bethy and Edith Kearney, accompanied by Mr. Finley Ferguson of Westerly and Mr. Fred Lawson of Fall River, were the guests of Ida M. Clark on Friday. Miss Edith and Miss Ida graduated from the New London Business College in the class of '96, end quote. So the children were going to college. Thomas Calder moved to Montana, and Isabel Calder attended New England Conservatory. Edith and Bessie would both become teachers in Westerly schools. And in 1901, Elizabeth marries Frederick Lawson in their parents' home on High Street, and they moved to Fall River. His family owned a monument business in Fall River associated with the Oak Grove Cemetery. So it clearly appears that the connections have been made through the Granite businesses that the family shared. This photograph of the Westerly High School class of 1899, online in the Westerly Library collection, is the only photo I've found of any of the Calders and Carneys, showing Isabel Calder in the bottom right. The young man to the left of her is C. Palmer Chapman, who she will marry in March 1902, and they move to Avondale. There are many social notices in the Westerly Sun thereafter of the Carneys and Calders visiting in Avondale. Shortly before Isabel's wedding, in the fall of 1901, Robert Calder takes Isabel and John to Scotland. And it appears that Robert's brother Thomas, who was living in Montana, likely joined them on that trip and then stayed for Isabel's wedding. Robert Calder's ill health is noted in the Sun story about them leaving to get the White Star Line ship Celtic out of New York City, and will be noted in several social notices of his visits to his niece and her family in Avondale. In 1906, Calder and Carney sell the quarry to a new corporation, Calder and Carney Westerly Granite, with Henry Smalley as president and Frederick Lawson as secretary-treasurer. So while the quarry was sold, there was still a family connection through Henry Carney's son-in-law. Following the sale, well, maybe son-in-law is not the right term, Isabel's husband, his niece's husband, is Frederick Lawson. Following the sale, Henry, Euphemia, and Edith Carney moved to Providence, and Robert Calder joined them. Robert Calder died in February 1915 and was buried in Riverbend Cemetery with a Masonic ceremony in the plot with John and Emma Calder, his younger brother and his wife. He was survived by two sisters and a brother in Scotland, and his brother Thomas in Montana, as well as his niece and nephew. Euphemia Carney died in 1925, and Henry Carney in 1937 at age 95. By contrast with the frequent reports that Robert Calder was ill, the Westerly Sun obituary says, quote, "He had been in good health up until yesterday and was remarkably keen and active, taking a great interest in all the news of the day, especially politics," end quote. He was a member of the Masonic Lodge and is buried in Riverbend Cemetery along with Euphemia and Edith. So that's a brief overview of the Calder and Carney families. But it also helped to understand what was going on business-wise in terms of Frederick Lawson being the original secretary-treasurer of the company that Smalley formed to buy the quarry. I'll talk now about one last item for their quarry, and then we'll look at where the different quarries were located. In 1916, Henry Smalley published advertisements with photos of the quarry and its powerhouse, from which the stone for the Titanic Memorial had been obtained. The ad on the left shows Smalley in a suit with a mustache and his superintendent, James Mackenzie, in the quarry. On the right, the ad notes the stone was, quote, imperial red Westerly granite, end quote. There's always salesmanship here. 17 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 4 feet thick. At this time, Smalley only owned the Calder and Kearney land. So that must be the source of the stone for this Titanic memorial. A story in Monumental News the previous year indicates the imperial red granite comes from the upper layers, while pink is from lower down. This picture was donated to the museum by James Mackenzie, shows himself and Smalley on the train car with the stone to be shipped to Quincy to be carved. Also in the archives of the museum is this sketch showing property owned by Smalley, the hatched area, and Smith North Quarry, dotted. It appears to have been drawn around 1930 because Smalley purchased the Dixon Sweeney Quarry in 1920 and the Macomber Quarry in 1925. And he'll sell all of these properties to the Smith's Pink Westerly quarries in 1931. We don't have a key to this map, but it's interesting as it shows the roads and railroad spurs leading into the different holes. Someone drew in pencil the Redstone Quarry of New England granite, but this map is a bit misleading because it is stretched in the north-south top-bottom direction and too narrow in the east-west direction. So we'll look at where the properties are on the town's GIS or Graphical Information System map. This is the GIS map with High Street on the left, the railroad across the bottom, Old Hopkinton Road on the right, and Route 78 across the top. Route 78 didn't exist in this period, and even Mountain Avenue and Hunter Terrace were just coming into existence in the early 1900s. The black lines outline current property boundaries. So all these lots in the black lines. Straight brown lines, like here and one here, indicate stone walls, which are frequently referenced in deeds. You'll also see bodies of water indicated in blue, many of which are, of course, quarry holes that are now filled with water. Here I'm showing you the approximate boundaries of the Smith North Quarry, and we'll come back and talk about what we know about that in a bit. And I indicated the general area of the New England Granite Redstone Quarry. But I want to start with Dixon Granite Works property in red, because when Harriet P. Dixon sells it to the Granite Works in 1893, it is a simple rectangular shape except for the curve of the railroad, and the survey drawing is included in the recorded deed. Its north boundary runs along stone walls that cross the current parcel. The current parcel goes all the way up to there, but the stone walls are right there. And the measurements are correct. These are from the deeds over the years, and they match if you measure on the GIS map. Obviously, some plots were broken out over time, and Hunter Terrace and Mountain Avenue created over on this side. The original deed says it is bounded on the east by Calder and Kearney and lands formerly of W.R. Fraser. The Macomber Quarry I've roughly indicated in blue because these two larger lots have that property history, but I haven't tried to determine the histories of all the lots along High Street and Mountain Avenue. So I'm not sure exactly what the original extent of Macomber-owned land is. North of the Dixon Sweeney Quarry are about 12 acres that Henry Smalley bought from John Sweeney in 1920. There were no quarries here, but the property description is very helpful because it says the eastern end is bounded by Calder and Kearney Westerly Granite Company. Calder and Kearney bought about 80 acres of land from the estate of Jonathan Lamphere and sold it to Smalley's Calder and Kearney Westerly Granite Company. Smalley in 1909 sold the northernmost 35 acres to David Talbot, and the recorded map shown here shows the really irregular borders of this of these 35 acres. Route 78 goes across the bottom of this land, so it's largely off the GIS map that I'm showing you. I mean, the part of the GIS map that I'm showing you. In 1920, Smalley sold about 22 acres south of Talbot's land to Alfred Lepico. I've drawn the northern boundary as a straight line, but it really has all the zigzags that are shown here in the Talbot map. You can match up in the deeds between the two of them. I just wasn't going to draw that. The Lepico land is now all smaller lots, so it's actually up here. But reviewing the property histories, the boundaries can match up, so it's shown in the dark blue outline. The properties from Stone Post 10 to Stone Post 11 have Smith land on their southern side, while from Stone Post 11 to 12 and further east, Calder and Kearney bound the southern side of the Lepico purchase. The remaining acres should be about 20, but are smaller, and I'm showing an approximation in green. Returning to the Smith North Quarry, the description in later sales is explicit that from the railroad, the property extends north 1,070 feet along the former Dixon land, and then goes east 490 feet. What did I do? Sorry, I'm confusing myself. Okay. There, 490 feet. So at this point, there's a little stone wall indicated on the GIS map. So I just extended it 490 feet. From here up to Stone Post 12, I've just drawn a straight line because, again, there's clearly zigzags and I can't tell exactly what's going on in there. Now, the remaining boundaries of the east and south of the Smith North Quarry are using current property lines, but they may not match quite the details in the deeds. The total acre is about 20 acres, and the description in the original 1850 deed says that the railroad is the southern bound. So this suggests to me that this is the original. This includes the original 20 acres that William Fraser sold to Orlando Smith. So notice that the Smith North Quarry is right next door to Dixon Sweeney, as well as right next door to Calder and Kearney, who said that they were behind Smith North Quarry in their advertising. Obviously, all these quarries have long histories, so knowing where land is doesn't specify which quarry hole or pond is the original, as additional holes were opened over time. Dixon, for instance, when it's sold to Sweeney, is specified as having 3 holes, but there's clearly more than 3 holes in that property as shown on the GIS map. Finally, stepping forward in time to 1939, This full-page ad by the Smith Granite Company specifically notes at the bottom of the page, quote, "Quarriers of all colors of Westerly granite controlling the original Westerly quarries and also the properties formerly of New England Granite Works, Redstone Quarry, and Calder and Kearney, Smalley, Pink, and Red Westerly." So Calder and Kearney was still a valuable brand name almost 50 years after they originally purchased the quarry. I've taken you through a whirlwind tour of Westerly red and pink granite, focusing on the quarries of Fraser and Smith, and then Jonathan Lamphere and Calder and Kearney and Smalley, with just a nod to the New England Granite Redstone Quarry. I was surprised at the unexpected connections among people such as Bathsheba Lamphere marrying William Fraser, or the later marriage of Elizabeth Kearney to Frederick Lawson. We've talked just a bit about memorials and the one statue, the Titanic Memorial, that's the only one of very few made out of red granite. And so with that, I'd like to thank you in red and pink.
So really only one monument that you know of made out of the red?
So I think the base of Stonewall Jackson was very highly carved. But generally, I mean, from very early on, the talk about red is always that, you know, it's best for building purposes.
It's got bigger grain.
It's got bigger grain. The pink, on the other hand, was definitely being sold and acquired for purposes of carving. But I think there may have just been a lot less of it than the blue or white or gray, whatever one wants to call the more common.
Pink was more difficult to carve.
Yeah.
Okay. And you said the red was more likely to be towards the top and the pink underneath?
Well, that was the description. Actually, that's described several times, at least for the one hole at Calder and Kearney. I don't, you know, I'm not a geologist, and Dale in his 1908 report has all kinds of details for each quarry about the strata and, you know, how things lay and what the mineral compositions are. You know, Westerly granite was distributed to labs as a standard for measuring materials that were in granite. There are tons of publications about I suspect it was, you know, more not the red and pink. It was the gray, white, blue granite. Yes.
You mentioned in the very beginning Native American red soapstone.
Steatite soapstone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any examples that we could actually see anywhere?
So I really don't know. It's in that Denison history in 1867, but I'm not familiar with Native American artifacts from Rhode Island, so I really don't know. Yes?
You said you had the Titanic Memorial?
Yeah,
Is that the boat, the Titanic?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that memorial, sometimes it's referred to as the Women's Memorial because starting very shortly after the Titanic sunk, there was an effort to get people, particularly women and children, to donate even just $1. And then the statue was designed by Vanderbilt, I'm blanking on her first name. Gertrude, right. And then the stone, Smalley supplied, clearly from the Calder and Kearney quarry that at that point he owned. And then it was brought up to Quincy and carved, and there are photographs of the carving of that statue in the Quincy. Yeah.
What's interesting is the name of that statue
It's in Washington, D.C. The picture that I showed you early on is its current location, which is next to the river. It was originally in, what was it called, Rocky Creek Park, I think, and it got moved. And it's a little confusing because it wasn't dedicated until 1931, but it actually was carved, and the stone was quarried back in 1914, 15, 16. So it then took, 15 years for, I think partly Congress was passed legislation, provided some money for its siting in Washington, D.C. And so there's this 15-year gap between when it's carved and when it's actually dedicated. Yes?
I never heard the word white granite before. Is that gray granite, or is it something different? And I never heard about blue granite either.
Oh, yeah.
Well, so there are people here with far more expertise in granite than me. I will just say that, again, the white granite and blue and gray, all these red, pink, they all come up in the very early, like that 1867 Denison history of Westerly granite. So, whether people would entirely agree on, which color is which, that's another matter. Anybody else want to comment on the colors?
I think it's just a tinge.
Yeah.
It's not like bright blue. I think it's just how the sun hits it, it's got a tinge of blue. And I think the white's the same.
Yeah.
The Westerly white was really the ones that made it famous were Smith. It was the Smith quarry, and if you polish it, it really does. It almost, if you see it at a bit of a distance, you think it was marble. It does. It looks white.
Beautiful.
And as a matter of fact, if you ever journey up to Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, they've cleaned several of the Smith white granite monuments that they have, and they look stunning.
Wow.
And the blue is just a little bit bluer when you look at it than the white, but Smith had both, and they're the finest grain. When you compare the pink, white, blue, red, the finest grain is the white and blue, as far as I know, and that's why that was what Smith would refer to as the statuary granite. Their carvers, if they were going to carve like a woman or an angel, and I'm sure plenty of other companies, Cadori, and there was a bunch, but that's the stone they would use. The red and the pink, more difficult to get the really fine carving that some people would want. But yeah, it literally does look white when it's polished.
Are there any examples here in this building?
Sullivan blue, because Sullivan marketed the
Well, they actually marketed it as blue white.
white, yeah.
Right. So there are examples in the room next door of some of the colors, not all the colors by any means. And, the different quarries obviously each had, so Sullivan blue white and the Smith white, probably look a little bit different, although more similar obviously than the pink or the red. So
why do we have all this granite here?
it's New England. There's lots of granite, not just here, but as you saw, Pawcatuck, East Lyme, Stony Creek.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, thank you very much.